to Sunday School, Upward Ministries here in Dover, Pennsylvania. We're so glad that you've joined us today as we continue our study of the prophecies of the Bible, what have come to pass and what have not yet come to pass. And for those who have been following along and have not been able to see every single episode, don't worry about it. All of these episodes are being recorded to be produced on DVD. So, you'll be able to get your hands on any episode that you may have missed. Okay? Alright. We are continuing in the book of Ezekiel. Let's turn to Ezekiel chapter 24, starting in verse 15. Prophecy 23:29. Here the Lord prophesies to Ezekiel. He tells Ezekiel that his wife is going to die. She will die of a stroke. And he commands him that after she dies, he is not to mourn for her at all. Okay, that's in verses 15 through 17. And then in verse 18, the prophecy comes to pass. His wife does die. Now, this is symbolic for a number of reasons. One reason is Jerusalem, Judah, they're about to be destroyed, and God is not going to mourn over them. I mean, Israel is married to God. God is married to Israel. But Israel has been unfaithful, and so the fate that Judah, Jerusalem, Israel shall meet will be well-deserved. It's a just ending. Plus, God will not mourn over the death of his bride, even though he will resurrect it later on. Then we go to verses 20 through 21. It says, "The word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Speak unto the house of Israel, thus saith the Lord God, Behold, I will profane my sanctuary, the excellency of your strength, the desire of your eyes. That which your soul pitieth, and your sons and your daughters, whom ye have left, shall fall by the sword." The desire of your eyes talks about the temple that will be destroyed, which of course did come to pass. And then we go down to verses 22 through 24. And here Ezekiel prophesies that just as he did not mourn over his wife, neither will you mourn over the loss of the temple, the desire of your eyes. Instead, you will just pine away in captivity and mourn amongst each other. Pining away means simply to become gaunt and unhealthy because of the grief that you're enduring. So that's prophecy 23:31. Prophecy 23:32. It's found in verses 25 through 26. This talks about how there will be those who survive the destruction and will come and give a report to Ezekiel. And then in verse 27, prophecy 23:33, it says, "In that day shall thy mouth be opened to him which is escaped, and thou shalt speak and be no more dumb, and thou shalt be a sign unto them, and they shall know that I am the Lord." So, a time will come when Ezekiel will be struck dumb, not be allowed to speak, and he will remain that way until this remnant that survives comes and gives him a report after the fall and total destruction of Jerusalem. I've read some commentaries that say that he won't be totally dumb. He'll just be dumb in preaching hope. Up to this point, he's only been preaching judgment. After the fall of Jerusalem, he'll be able to preach hope. Whether that's true, I'm not entirely certain. I guess you just had to be there to know for sure. Okay. Well, now we move on to chapter 25. Here, we begin the judgments that will fall on Gentile nations. Chapter 25 covers several Gentile nations. Verses 1 through 5 1 through 7 cover judgment that will fall upon the Amorites. Starting in verse 1, the word of the Lord God came unto me, saying, Son of man, set thy face against the Ammonites, and prophesy against them, and say unto the Ammonites, Hear the word of the Lord. Thus saith the Lord God, because thou saidest, Aha, against my sanctuary when it was profaned, and against the land of Israel when it was desolate, and against the house of Judah when they went into captivity. Behold, I will deliver you to the men of the east for a possession, and they will set their palaces in you, and make their dwellings in you. They shall eat thy fruit, and they shall drink thy milk. Okay, so the Ammonites are going to be invaded, and then prophecy 23:35, and I will make Rabbah a city in the land, no doubt, a stable for camels, and the Ammonites a couching place for flocks. Yet you shall know that I am the Lord. That pretty much means Rabbah will just become a wilderness where only animals will graze and be pastured. Okay, and then verses 6 and 7, prophecy 23:36. For thus saith the Lord God, because thou hast clapped thine hands and stamped with thy feet and rejoiced in heart with all thy despite against the land of Israel, behold, therefore I will stretch out my hand upon thee, and will deliver thee for a spoil to the heathen, and I will cut thee off from thy people. So God is pretty much saying any nation that takes delight in the fall of Israel will also suffer consequences. Nobody escapes God's watch. Nobody. Okay, then verses 8 through 11, judgment on Moab. Thus saith the Lord God, because that Moab and Seir do say, Behold, the house of Judah is like unto all heathen. Therefore I will open the side of Moab from his cities which are his frontiers, the glory of the country, Beth Jeshimoth, Baal-meon, and Kirathaim, unto the men of the east with the Ammonites, and will give them in possession, that the Ammonites may not be remembered among the nations, and I will execute judgments upon Moab, and they will know that I am God. That's prophecy 2:3-7. Okay. In both cases, it talks about the men of the east. No doubt this is Babylon, because Josephus, the great Jewish historian, tells us that Nebuchadnezzar conquered Ammon in the 5th year after the destruction of Jerusalem, and it was at the same time that Moab, Edom, and other countries fell. Remember, we talked about Nebuchadnezzar being a battle axe in God's hand. he is just using Babylon to conquer everybody. Thus became the rise of Babylon as a world power, which then fall to the Median Persians, which then fall to the Greeks, and then finally to the Roman Empire, which was in power at the first coming of the Messiah. Okay. Verses 12 through 14, prophecy 23:38. This talks about the judgment on Edom. It says, because that Edom hath dealt against the house of Judah by taking vengeance, and hath greatly offended and revenged himself upon them. Therefore, thus saith the Lord God, I will also stretch out my hand upon Edom, and will cut off man and beast from it. I will make it desolate from Teman, and they of Dedan shall fall by the sword. And I will lay my vengeance upon Edom by the hand of my people Israel, and they shall do in Edom according to mine anger and according to my fury. So, in the case of Edom, God's judgment will come from Israel. And then finally, verses 15 through 17, prophecy 23:39. This is judgment against Philistia. It says, thus saith the Lord God, because the Philistines have dealt by revenge and have taken vengeance with a despiteful heart to destroy it for the old hatred. Therefore, thus saith the Lord God, behold, I will stretch out my hand upon the Philistines, and will cut off the Cherethims, and destroy the remnant of the sea coast. And I will execute great vengeance upon them with furious rebukes, and they shall know that I am the Lord when I lay my vengeance upon them. Okay. Now we move to the great city of Tyre. Tyre actually covers the next 3 chapters. So God has a lot to say in regards to the great city of Tyre. Chapter 26, verse 1. And it came to pass in the 11th year, in the first day of the month, that the word of the Lord came unto me. Now, notice it says the 11th year in the first day of that month. This is the 11th year after Jehoiachin's captivity. The month that Jerusalem fell in the 11th year was the 4th. This is found in 2 Kings 25, verses 3 and 8. This prophecy began to be fulfilled then, but it took Nebuchadnezzar 13 years to overthrow the city of Tyre, which is called the city of Tyrus here in chapter 26. Furthermore, according to Josephus, while besieging Jerusalem, Nebuchadnezzar had driven Pharaoh back to Egypt, and Tyre rejoiced over this and the fall of Judah. Then, and as in these prophecies, her own downfall was predicted. Yes, while God did indeed bring judgment upon Israel, he also brought judgment on any nation that took any kind of rejoicing and delight in the fall of Jerusalem. Okay. We start verses 3 through 6, prophecy 23:40. It says, I am against thee, O Tyrus, and will cause many nations to come up against thee, as the sea causeth his waves to come up. So it won't just be one nation. It won't be just Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon, but there will be others. It says, and they shall destroy the walls of Tyrus, and break down her towers. I will also scrape her dust from her, and make her like the top of a rock. It shall be a place for the spreading of nets in the midst of the sea, for I have spoken it, saith the Lord God, and it shall become a spoil to the nations, and her daughters which are in the field shall be slain, and they shall know that I am the Lord. So this prophecy says Tyre will become absolutely desolate. It'll just be a giant rock where nets will be spread upon. And the thing is, Tyre is a seaport city that did a lot of sea trade. Merchants from many nations did trade for the city of Tyre. So this was a busy city with a lot of wealth. And, the bringing of destruction upon it just seems unfathomable. I'm sure that there were buildings everywhere, but it was leveled. Okay, then verses 7 through 9, prophecy 23:41. For thus saith the Lord, behold, I will bring upon Tyrus Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and king of kings from the north, with horses and with chariots and with horsemen and much people. He will slay with a sword thy daughters in the field. He shall make up a fort against thee, and cast them out against thee, and lift up the buckler against thee. So 23:41 is the prophecy of Nebuchadnezzar coming to invade. And verses 10 and 11, this deals specifically with his horses. He talks about how his horses, by their dust shall cover thee, the walls will shake at the noise of the horsemen, and of the wheels of the chariots. And then with the hooves of his horses shall he tread down on all thy streets. He shall slay the people with the sword. So, prophecy 23:42 talks about an abundance of horses that will be invading Tyre. Verses 12 through 14, prophecy 23:43, it says, and they shall make a spoil of thy riches. Now, notice this goes from singular. In verse 8 it says, he shall slay with the sword. Then verse 12 it says, and they shall make a spoil of thy riches. So, as spoken of at the beginning of the chapter, there will be many nations that will rise up against Tyre. And verses 12 through 14 could be referring to Alexander the Great, because according to history, ancient history, 12 through 14 were literally fulfilled when Alexander invaded the city of Tyre. Its final ruin would come in the year 1291 A.D. by the Sultan of Egypt. So its desolation didn't happen, right away. It took centuries, but eventually it did become desolate, never to rise again. Okay. Prophecy 23:44, verse 15. Thus saith the Lord God to Tyrus, shall not the isles shake at the sound of thy fall, when the wounded cry, when the slaughter is made in the midst of thee? So isles are going to shake as Tyre falls. Then verses 16 and 17, prophecy 23:45, says, and all the princes of the sea shall come down from their thrones and lay away their robes, and put off their embroidered garments. They shall clothe themselves with trembling. And they shall take up lamentation, and say to thee, how art thou destroyed? And thou wast inhabited of seafaring men, the renowned city, which was strong in the sea, she and her inhabitants, which caused their terror. So this prophecy talks about how princes of many nations are going to just lament at the loss of Tyre, and most likely because it's just an economic haven. So nations will suffer heavily economically from the fall of Tyre. And verses 18 and 19, now shall the isles tremble in the day of the fall, yea, the isles that are in the sea shall be troubled at thy departure. For thus saith the Lord, when I shall make thee a desolate city like the cities that are not inhabited, when I shall bring up the deep upon me, the great waters shall cover thee. Oh my. So here, this is a prophecy of water coming upon the city, which, being a seaport city, is entirely possible. Flooding, tidal waves. I mean, anything's possible here. And since God said He was going to do it, rest assured, He's done it. Okay. And then verse 21, I will make thee a terror, and thou shalt be no more. Though thou be sought for, yet thou shalt never be found again, saith the Lord God. Okay. Now that was prophecy 23:48. Now we move to chapter 27. The first 26 verses of this chapter just give a description of present day. Well, when I say present day, I'm talking about present day at the time that these words were written, way back when. It's just it's a very vivid description, and verses 5 through 9 talk about how mighty the navy of Tyre was. Verses 10 and 11 talk about how mighty the army of Tyre was. And finally, verses 12 through 25 talk about all the cities that did business in Tyre. The many, many merchants that came to Tyre, and how much money exchanged in Tyre. Now, if you go back to verse 3, it says, Thus saith the Lord God, O Tyrus, thou hast said, I am of perfect beauty. Now, interestingly enough, this is how Lucifer described himself before he chose to rebel against God. He said, I am of perfect beauty. And, when I read about the merchants of Tyre and just what a great economic power it was, and all the lamentations that would take place when it fell, it really makes me think of end times Babylon in the book of Revelation. Babylon is also described as a great economic city, and when it falls, there would be great sorrow and grieving over the loss of this economic power. So it seems to me that Tyre is both a literal city, and it's also symbolic of end times Babylon. There is some argument as to whether end times Babylon is a literal city or symbolic of something else. That's really not something we'll know for certain until after the end times. But, the fact that Tyre is described exactly like end times Babylon, there is certainly plenty of reason to believe that end times Babylon will also be an actual city also. All right. So anyway, that's the verses 1 through 26 are the description of Tyre. Now we move on to the prophecies, starting 26 through 27. Prophecy 23:49, Thy rowers have brought thee into great waters, the east wind hath broken thee in the midst of the seas. Thy riches and thy fares and thy merchandise, thy mariners and thy pilots, thy caulkers, and the occupiers of thy merchandise, and all thy men of war that are in thee, and in all thy company which is in the midst of these, they shall fall into the midst of the seas in the day of thy ruin. So, we're talking about all the business men, whatever their jobs may have been. They will all fall into the sea. I mean, whether they were... whether they were actually part of the cheering of the destruction of Jerusalem or not. They shall all fall into the sea. Verse 28, prophecy 23:50, The suburbs shall shake at the ground of thy pilots, Verse 29, and all that handle the oar, the mariners and all the pilots of the sea, shall come down from the ships, and they will stand upon the land. Most likely to just stare at the destruction of Tyre. And then verses 30 and 31, prophecy 23:52. And shall cause their voice to be heard against thee, and shall cry bitterly, and shall cast dust upon their heads, and they shall roll themselves in the ashes, and shall make themselves utterly bald for thee. So all this has to do with great meaning, great grieving and mourning. You put on sackcloth, ashes, cry bitterly, shave your heads, all signs of mourning. Verses 32 and 33, prophecy 23:53. And in their wailing they shall take up a lamentation for me, and lament over thee, saying, what city is like Tyrus, like the destroyed in the midst of the sea? So here Ezekiel is prophesying exactly what kind of song of lamentation they're going to be singing. They're just going to be singing about what a great city it used to be. Just a wishing for better days. Verse 34, in the time when thou shalt be broken by the seas in the depths of the waters, thy merchandise and all thy company in the midst of thee shall fall. So all of the merchandise of all thy company shall fall into the depths of the water. Verse 35, all the inhabitants of the isles shall be astonished at thee, and their kings shall be sore afraid, they shall be troubled in their countenance. When you see, it's understandable when they see a mighty city like Tyre fall. That is scary, because the same fate most certainly could befall their great cities and their great kingdoms. And finally, verse 36, prophecy 23:56. The merchants among the people shall hiss at thee. Thou shalt be a terror, and never shalt be any more. Again, this is the same prophecy that's spoken over, I believe, Ammon, that they shall be no more. Okay. Well, that's all the time we have for today. Join us next week when we shall begin chapter 28 of Ezekiel. Thank you.
Let you